Episode 1 in Ken Burns's The Civil War, The Cause 1861, discusses the causes of the Civil War as well as early battles.
This episode tells of many causes of the war, from King Cotton in the South to abolitionists in the North who opposed it. The firing on Fort Sumter and major figures like Lincoln, Douglas, and Lee are introduced.
This episode explains many direct and indirect events leading to the war, and why the spirit of crisis that delayed the war finally broke down in 1860. Number 1. Slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. Thanks to the work of abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe, slavery was becoming too big of an issue to be ignored.
The Cotton Kingdom and the South were the heavy supporters of slavery, while the North were becoming increasingly more hostile towards slavery.
In a later attempt to explain the war, Abraham Lincoln famously said, "Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came."
Number 2. On October 16, 1859, radical abolitionist John Brown led an uprising at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to rally slaves in order to end slavery. Brown's uprising completely failed, and he was captured and executed.
Please enjoy this brief reenactment of the raid. Brown's revolt was a direct cause of the Civil War since it turned the Southern militia into a viable military force and led to the beginning of the Confederate Army.
Number 3. By the election of 1860, the country was falling apart. The South was beginning to consider secession a viable option as the country was hopelessly split over slavery.
In the election, the new Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln as their candidate against the hopelessly split Democratic Party. Lincoln won, which enraged the South.
Number 4. The South knew that they would soon face great challenges in their fight for slavery. Soon after Lincoln's election, Southern states began to succeed in earnest, starting with South Carolina.
On February 18, 1861, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as President of the Provisional Confederate States of America. The United States was no more.
Number 5. The Civil War opened with the assault on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Northern troops were forced to surrender to a Confederate battalion in a relatively bloodless affair.
Soon after, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers for the Union. Davis soon followed suit, calling for 100,000 volunteers for the Confederacy. The Union begins to push into the South, dispersing slavery wherever they go.
Number 6. On July 21, 1861, the Union Army marched into Virginia in an attempt to take the Confederate capital of Richmond. Called the First Battle of Bull Run, it was the first major battle of the Civil War and resulted in a Southern victory thanks to Stonewall Jackson.
Sullivan Ballou, a Union soldier, wrote a letter to his wife before the battle that captures both the harsh reality of the situation and the soldiers' willingness to fight for their respective causes. He was killed during the battle.
Question 1. There were several events that led to the Civil War. The issue of slavery was the primary issue for the war's beginning, as most of the events that sparked the war all stemmed from slavery. The South were firm believers in slavery, while the North believed that slavery was evil. The North was highly influenced by abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe.
An event that further complicated things was the John Brown Revolt. The John Brown Revolt sparked even more Northern animosity for slavery, but also ended up turning the Southern militia into a viable army, laying the ground roots for the Confederate Army.
The event that finally pushed the South into splitting and war was the election of Abraham Lincoln as president. Lincoln was completely against slavery, and so the South was enraged when he was elected. Once he was elected, the South began to succeed, starting with South Carolina, basically signaling the start of an imminent war. While slavery was the main cause of the war, other issues such as the South's fear of Northern dominance were also an important factor.
Question 2. The spirit of compromise finally broke down in 1860 because the North and South simply couldn't agree with each other over slavery anymore.
All along, the two sides had vastly different viewpoints on slavery, and their previous compromises over it, such as the Missouri Compromise and Compromise of 1850, simply served to stall the inevitable dispute over it. This issue was something that both sides were so passionate about that the only solution was if one side completely won out over the other.
The final straw was when Abraham Lincoln, an ardent abolitionist, was elected president. Now please enjoy the following clip, which discusses slavery in the South, the cause of the Civil War.
This clip was selected because it establishes how slavery, along with the lack of compromise between the North and the South, caused the Civil War.
If there was a single event that caused the war, it was the establishment of the United States in independence from Great Britain, with slavery still a part of its heritage.
It was because we failed to do the thing we really have a genius for, which is compromise. Americans like to think of themselves as uncompromising. Our true genius is for compromise. Our whole government's founded on it, and it failed.
There was never a moment in our history when slavery was not a sleeping serpent. It lay coiled up under the table during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention. Owing to the cotton gin, it was more than half awake. Thereafter, slavery was on everyone's mind, though not always on his tongue. John J. Chapman.
By the time the nation was founded, slavery was dying in the North. There were doubts in the South, too, but few could conceive of any alternative. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia said maintaining slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You didn't like it, but you didn't dare let it go. Then in 1793, a Northerner, Eli Whitney, taught the South how to make slavery pay. Whitney's engine, or gin, made it easier to separate cotton from its seed. Where before it had taken one slave 10 hours to produce a single pound of lint, the cotton gin could crank out 1,000 pounds a day. Production soared, and with it, the demand for slaves. By 1860, the last year of peace, 1 out of every 7 Americans belonged to another American. 4 million men, women, and children were slaves.
In thinking of America, I sometimes find myself admiring her bright blue sky, her grand old woods, her fertile fields, her beautiful rivers, her mighty lakes and star-crowned mountains. But my rapture is soon checked when I remember that all is cursed with the infernal spirit of slaveholding and wrong, when I remember that with the waters of her noblest rivers, the tears of my brethren are borne to the ocean, disregarded and forgotten, that her most fertile fields drink daily of the warm blood of my outraged sisters, I am filled with unutterable loathing. Frederick Douglass.